Hello, welcome to the channel. My name's Matt. This is Basking the Story, and today we're doing our December wrap-up. So this will be the last video about 2023. As we now well into 2024, we've done our top 10 video, we've done our top 10 fiction, we've done our top 5 non-fiction from last year. Now we're into the last 2023 video, which will be December wrap-up. We read 7 books in December, the vast majority of which was fantasy. There was a sci-fi, which we'll come on to, and one classic as well, which I'll come on to as well. But I'll start with the fantasy because it makes sense to start with the biggest bulk of the reading first. And the first book was actually a reread, so it was Remember December Readathon, and that was about rereading a book, and it could have been, I think there was three prompts. So one was to reread in a format you hadn't read before, one was to reread a book that you know you've read but don't really remember anything about, and there was a third prompt which I cannot remember, and it doesn't really matter. So I took a book that I've read several times but read it in a different format, and that was The Hobbit by obviously JRR Tolkien. And I didn't read the book, so I've read the physical book a few times, including an illustrated version, but on this occasion I listened to the audiobook, and I listened to Andy Serkis's audiobook. Do I need to recap the story of The Hobbit? Bilbo Baggins goes on an adventure. Hobbits aren't really meant to go on an adventure. He goes on an adventure with a load of dwarfs, Gandalf the wizard, and they go and face Smaug the Magnificent, the dragon, as beautifully depicted here, and try and win the dwarfs' treasure back. And it's just an adventure-packed story. There's every chapter is a new adventure, and I've got a lot of childhood memories wrapped up in this book, so it is one of my all-time favourites. But Andy Serkis's audiobook was exceptional. It was beautiful. His voice work was just the characterisation was magnificent, and I suppose that shouldn't be a surprise really. He is obviously an incredibly well-trained actor, and renowned for his characterisation of various curious roles, including obviously Gollum in the films, but his voice work was brilliant in this. And also it was nice because there's so many songs in this, and I'm pretty much tone deaf, so all the songs in this had, well, in my head, lacked quite a bit of rhythm and certainly a lot of musical aptitude, so they were pretty mundane, but he added some rhythm to them. He added some musical clarity, and obviously they were reasonably in tune as well. So it added to the musical elements of this book, which was fun to listen to. But yeah, I love this book. As another book I'll reread and probably re-listen to again. So that was a good start to the month. I also listened to another audiobook talking about comforting reads, and I listened to Travis Baldree's Legends and Lattes. This was my first sort of venture into the cosy fantasy. It seemed like the right time of year as we were building up to Christmas to dip into cosy fantasy, especially as the weather was turning cold as well. And I decided to listen to this rather than read it physically because Travis Baldree is a prolific audiobook narrator, so it made sense to listen to his book as he was narrating his own work. And his performance was, as usual, superb. But why this story? So this story is about Viv, an orc who's setting up a bakery, a coffee house with a bakery attached. And I mentioned the bakery first because the food element of the story, talking about the food, was as mouth-watering. I'm not a big coffee drinker, but the food got to me definitely during this book. And it's about her entering this new community and setting up this coffee house, and no one knows what coffee is, and building that community spirit. And it's a heartwarming story. They say it's high fantasy with low stakes, and it's low stakes in the sense of it's not your traditional epic fantasy of earth-shattering good versus evil, but the stakes are high for the individuals involved in the story. And I think you need individually high stakes to really get a heartwarming story, and that's what this is. A heartwarming story. It's about community, it's about belonging, it's about love, it's about friendship, and it's just wonderfully told. And I like the way the fantasy was just part of the world, and Travis Baldree has created a beautiful world, and it's just little simple things that make it feel real, and you're settled in the real world, because it's pretty much all told from Viv's viewpoint, so the orc's viewpoint. There's things like when she's moving stuff around, rather than the phrase being that Viv manhandled these boxes, she orc handled these boxes. So it's just those little things which would be obviously the phraseology that an orc would use, makes sense. So it was a beautiful story. It was good. Wasn't my favourite read of the month, but it was a solid, entertaining, comforting read. A feel good book, perfect for pre-Christmas reading. Moving on with the fantasy, I continued my first ever read of Harry Potter, and I read the 6th book, The Half-Blood Prince, and this is my favourite one so far. This was brilliant, magnificent. We're into Harry's 6th year at Hogwarts. The danger has mounted up enormously. The characterization and the characters that J.K. Rowling has developed and built through this story are magnificent. And their interactions and their relationships are wonderfully written, and we're getting darker and darker, which I enjoyed. And as I say, the stakes are getting higher and higher, and there's moments in this book that were a shock. I'm not going to say more than that, because if you haven't read it, I strongly advise you do. I know most people will have read it and know what I'm talking about, but the ending of this book, wow, I was not expecting it, because I've managed to keep away from most of that, amazingly, and wow, it was just a brilliant story. I'm really looking forward to finishing this series soon. Maybe February, maybe March, we'll see. But soon I'll get onto the 7th book, The Deathly Hallows, and finish the series. But yeah, from the first 2 books of this series being mediocre, it's really picked up, and now this is a wonderful addition to the story, and just the lines being drawn between the different sides and who sits where over those lines. It should be an epic conclusion. So that is the next one I read. I then actually finished a series which I started and finished in the same year, which was wonderful, which was John Gwynne's The Faithful and the Fallen. So the 4th book was Wrath, depending on how you want to say it. And this was a great conclusion to the 4 books. He's got an ability to tell a story through multi-point of view that works so well, and I think one of the reasons it works so well is each point of view progresses the story, and that was probably most evident in this book, and it is in all 3 books before this, but this book is probably the most evident because we're reaching a conclusion. Storylines are coming together, but each storyline was progressing the plot further and further. It wasn't a case of storylines sort of covering the same events from different viewpoints. It was actually each storyline moved it on, and that was superb. And this was an epic conclusion to an epic fantasy series, and it's it's a typical good versus evil world, high stakes. This is high stakes compared to Lessons and Lattes. This is what I think people mean by high stakes. This is the end of the world, good versus evil, high stakes, and I wouldn't say it does anything massively new for sort of the epic fantasy genre, but what it does do, and the tropes, and it's reasonably trope heavy. You've got animal companions, you've got prophecy, you've got sort of farm boy done good, blacksmith boy done good, I suppose. You've got good versus evil. You've got so many found family. There's so many tropes in this, but they're done really, really well. And tropes are tropes for a reason, because generally they work if done well, and this does them exceptionally well. And it's a little bit darker than some of the more traditional epic fantasy, which is sort of the trend in sort of more modern fantasy, to be a bit more darker. It's a bit more brutal in its execution. John Gwynne writes the fight scenes magnificently and feel real. It feels like he knows what he is talking about. I believe he does reenactments of battles, so I think he's got some experience and a knowledge of how sword fights would have worked in that sort of era. So this was brilliant. It was a fantastic conclusion. I think the 2nd book was probably my favourite. The 2nd, 3rd and 4th books were all fantastic. And the 1st book was solid. It's just I felt the 2nd book stepped up the storyline, and then the 3rd and 4th book continued that magnificent telling. So that was the next book that I read. And then my final fantasy read, which it is fantasy, but it's very much more historical fantasy, almost historical fiction with some magical realism thrown in, I suppose, is what it would be. But that was Babel, by RF Kuang. This was a group read, it turned out being, on MJ's Discord, Reading This Life. And it was wonderful to discuss this book as we were reading it and get other people's viewpoints. But this is, it'll be dark academia, but it starts off with a young boy in Canton in China who is brought to England. This is set in sort of the early 1800s, so just prior to Queen Victoria's reign. And we've got this young boy is brought in by this professor at Oxford University and then raised by him to become a translator at the Tower of Babel, or Tower of Babel, I should say, and in Oxford University. And this is where effectively they inscribe different words onto silver and it creates power, and the power is generated by the different meanings of different words in different languages and different origins of words. And if you like sort of etymology, then this was a fascinating read. I am sort of quite into etymology and the meaning of words and where words come from and their origins, and also how they change and evolve over time, but also how they change and evolve through languages and different languages as well, and how different words with similar meanings in other languages also have differences within that. And this plays on that a lot in this book. This book is really about colonialism, and effectively you've got the British Empire then using this silver, this magical silver, to spread their influence, and the importance of the translators in creating these words on this silver with meaning, because you need people who understand the meanings of them to make the magic work. And the magic system is fairly soft, like it doesn't answer all the questions. There is an explanation of how the words work in it, but it's reasonably soft. And also, why I started off saying this is more historical fiction than fantasy is this is set in a very specific time period in Britain and China, really, mainly in Britain, but also in China, and it's very much historically set, so it fits within what actually happened historically, and then the fantasy magic side of it is an addition to give a focus on this fictional Tower of Babel and the importance of that in the story. So it's an odd one in that sense. Now I think the writing in this is I thoroughly enjoyed writing this. I thought she did a very good job of moving the story with the explanation of the etymology. Now if you don't like etymology, you will find probably this feels like a lot of explanation, a lot of people explaining how things work. And I think maybe because I enjoy a lot of sci-fi, that didn't bother me quite so much, but it does have that within this. And if that is not your thing, that may affect your enjoyment of reading this. And also, one thing of this, the pacing wasn't consistent throughout the book. It started well and was, moving along, and then we had this sort of slump, maybe just over halfway, and then it picked up suddenly again, and then we slumped back down again, and it picked up again at the end. So it was a bit unbalanced in the pacing. And so I wouldn't say it was a perfect book, but it was highly entertaining. I thought its view on colonialism was powerful. I think some people will find it a bit too much, maybe blunt and in your face, but I thought it worked well, and I thought the points being made through it were well thought out and well executed. And I'm considering doing a full book review, probably spoiler book review on this, to discuss some of the thoughts I've had. So you can maybe be able to see that in maybe the next week or so. Have no idea when I'm going to film it. But I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was, this and a couple of other books meant I had to finish these before I decided on my top 10 fiction for the end of the year, because this was certainly a contender for that. And if you haven't watched that video, you can go check it out, because you can find out whether this actually made the top 10 or not. Right, so that was all the fantasy. Then we move on to, we've got one sci-fi, one classic. The sci-fi was I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. People have been going on at me to read this for a while. It's a really short book. It's been on a couple of TBRs last year and I never got to it. This was superb. I thoroughly enjoyed this, and it's about a man, sort of the last man on Earth after a catastrophic apocalyptic event, and there's these vampires who are humans, and they're after him. They want blood. They want to feast upon him, and it's it's really, I suppose it's sort of in 3 parts, but it's him living what life he has left, and you start to learn the loss that he suffered, but then there's also his investigation into what is happening, why it's happening, what's causing this impact on humans, why are humans becoming vampires, and why do certain things kill these vampires and other things don't, and his discovery and research into that. And then we get this conclusion to the story that it just, the final third of this book is just wonderful. It's such the reveals will blindside you, I believe, and the gut punch of sort of the final scene is just so emotional, and it's just so impactful. It's just brilliant. And I think, I mean, the Will Smith film does not do this justice at all, but because those final scene, and when you hear the proclamation, you know, I am legend, superb, you know, absolutely superb. There's a bit in here, you know, I think you may find this is I don't know when this was written. I mean, it's a little bit, it is a sort of classic of the genre. So 50s, 54 is written, and there is, you know, some views held by the man around his sexual need and desire that are a bit odd, probably in today's society, but other than that, this works brilliantly. I just can't go over the ending of this book. It was so good, so good. It is one of, you know, my favourite endings to a book, and yeah, magnificent, absolutely magnificent. So the final book I read in 2023 in the year was A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. I've never read this before. I am a massive fan of The Muppets Christmas Carol. In my opinion, the best Christmas film ever. And I would argue Michael Caine's greatest ever performance, and he should have won an Oscar for it. Let me know if you agree with me in the comments or not. But this was again a very short read. I know a lot of people read this at Christmas, and a lot of people have the habit of rereading it every year, and I can see myself doing that because it is a wonderful story. Again, it's heartwarming, and it was nice to see that The Muppets Christmas Carol does sort of follow the storyline reasonably closely. There's obviously artistic license taken in places, but it's just a wonderful Christmas story. And Dickens's descriptions of Scrooge himself are just wonderfully visual and just give you this impression of the man so quickly. You know, in a paragraph, you get such a crisp, clear image of who this person is, not just what they look like, but who they are. And then you see that transition as he's visited by the 3 ghosts to who he becomes. And there's part in here that isn't in the films, which is where you find these 2 children with one of the ghosts. I'm not going to say much about it, but if you've read it, you probably know. And that was surprisingly impactful and haunting. And I can't understand sort of why it wasn't in the films, in the Muppet films, but it certainly had an impact that I wasn't expecting, that the visualization of these 2 children with the ghosts and their meaning within that story. Superb. I can see myself rereading this most years. Again, it's only a short one. You know, I know some people would read it in a day. For me, realistically, it'd probably be a couple of days. But I can see myself rereading this every Christmas, just to get that feeling, that spirit of what Christmas is and how it should be celebrated. And that concludes my 2023 reading. So that was my December wrap up. As I say, it was a fabulous way to end the year. And if you haven't checked out my top 10 2023 video, please do. I'll put it up in the end credits of this video, so you can click on that and view that. But you may see some of these books appear on that, and that's why it didn't come out till January. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.